Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to Greater Washington's webinar series, Getting Around. My name is Alex Baca. I'm the DC Policy Director at Greater Washington, and I'm here today with Chris Florinach and Emily Oxford from Nelson Nygaard Consulting Associates, with whom GGWash worked on the analysis and report that we're going to present data from today. That project was generously funded by the Energy Foundation and Energy Action Foundation, and in it we looked at travel trends in Washington DC in March 2019 as compared to March 2020. So we will be talking through Nelson Nygaard's analysis today. Emily will be presenting the bulk of that and doing our best to answer some of your questions. It's a GGWash webinar, so I expect lots of activity in the chat and the Q&A. Looking forward to seeing what you all have to say. Feel free to drop things in there. We will do our best to answer them and integrate them, and we will save time for a dedicated Q&A section after the presentation. Before we get started, I just want to share Chris and Emily's very impressive bios. Give me one moment to pull them up. Chris has worked to improve urban transportation and development for more than 25 years. Starting from a technical base of forecasting the demand for regional transportation investments, he has focused on the policies that ensure transportation systems support sustainable, equitable community building. He has contributed to early work on recognizing the environmental benefits of smart growth, changing parking policy, and reforming federal transportation funding. He is renowned for interpreting technical results legibly for policymakers and the public, which he is very graciously doing for us today. Chris has also served as the chair of the Arlington County Planning Commission in Virginia as it accelerated a successful transition from stagnant suburb to vibrant urban community. Emily has been working in the planning field for over 10 years with experience spanning from trails planning in New Mexico to capital project prioritization for Navy installations. At Nelson Nygaard, Emily supports the active transportation, transit, cities and streets, and parking demand management sectors on projects across the country. Within DC, Emily has played an integral role in many key transportation projects, including a joint DDOT MPS project to extend the 15th Street cycle track through the National Mall, an American Cities Climate Challenge study to advance planning and design for 2 transit priority corridors, DDOT's DC Safe Routes to School Planning Assistance Program, and a preliminary study on decongestion pricing for the DC Sustainable Transportation Coalition. Emily previously worked for the City of Alexandria, an environmental nonprofit, and a Santa Fe-based landscape architecture firm. I like to count these two among some of the smartest that we know in our orbit. And again, I'm so glad they're here today to present our work. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Emily.
Hi, everyone. I'm actually going to just share my screen and then kick it to Chris. So here you go. Everyone can see what they need to see, right?
We'll give you a second to make sure you have it on the right monitor, as Zoom inevitably takes over the wrong one in my experience. Hi, everyone. Thank you, as I'll add my welcome to Alex's. Thank you for joining us today. The Greater Washington community is one that we're proud to be a part of, both in our day jobs and in our evenings and weekend advocacy. So thank you to Alex and team for inviting us to present this work today. We'll be talking about changes in travel patterns to, from, and within Washington over the loosely defined COVID period, specifically defined 2019 to 2022. And I'll start us off, next slide, please, in just a moment, by talking about some of the basics of the research that we did with support from Greater Washington, some of the data sources we used, some of the benefits and, frankly, limitations of those data sources, how we chose which submarkets within the region and within the city to look at, and then Emily will walk us through the details of the analysis before we circle back and talk about some takeaways from the research. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, how did travel change over that period, and how do we know? Next slide. So we all know anecdotally from our own experience, and certainly by reading media sources being active participants in the Greater Washington universe, that the travel changed significantly during the COVID period, and we have at least some prior expectations, not prior to COVID, but prior expectations to looking at this work as to how that travel might have changed. What we see most broadly is that across the region, the peaks are much less pronounced, and we see a sort of smoothing across the day of activity, regardless of which mode you're looking at. We see that notably and and to great satisfaction, the number of cycling trips in DC has increased significantly, while most other travel has declined during the COVID period. We see that walking trips have decreased, and the asterisk there is simply to note that we're relying on one data source for this analysis. And I personally, and we generally, are not totally convinced that its data or the information that it provides accurately represents the universal walking trips. So we'll have some discussion about that in a moment. We know, in Greater Washington is highlighted throughout the pandemic, that while we saw transit ridership decline, we saw rail ridership decline precipitously, and bus ridership be more resilient. Not that there weren't declines in bus ridership, but we all came to understand quite vividly that the people who we finally came to call, essential workers, going out and doing their jobs during the heart of the pandemic, were relying on the bus disproportionately to get to those jobs. And so bus ridership remained resilient. Again, that meets our prior expectations. And then what's usually the headline, and we've left it for last here, when you see reporting about travel during the pandemic, is that vehicle trips went down significantly. And here, and on the next slide in just a moment, we'll talk about some of the data that's used that we use to analyze. But vehicle trips here within the region, what we're talking about is trips that are between DC and the rest of the region. So this is not the same number as if you took the INRIX report or AAA's report about all travel within the region. This is looking at those trips that touch DC from the region, right? So those trips overall were down 37%. So I promised that I would go deep into the data, and knowing this crowd and the Greater Washington community, you're going to be interested in these details. So we use two sources of data. Mainly we use the one on the left, the StreetLight data, StreetLight AI. It's a company that many of you are probably familiar with. Their data is becoming more widely used in transportation planning. What they mostly provide is trip data, but it's important to understand that the data that they're using to construct those trips is location-based service data predominantly. So what that means is pings from your cell phone, various apps report your location at various times that can be accumulated, aggregated by a company like StreetLight. And then they have proprietary algorithms that turn those cell phone pings into trip records. And you can imagine in a complex environment like DC, seeing a cell phone moving through space, it may be hard to tell from the speed at which that phone is moving, from the path that phone is taking. It may be hard to tell what mode that the person carrying that cell phone is actually taking. We can all think, I'm sure, of when we've been in a bus that's moving just as fast as the traffic around it, when we've been on a bike that's moving maybe faster than the vehicle traffic around it, and interpreting those cell phone pings and putting them into trips is the result of StreetLight's proprietary algorithms. And that's where some of the concern about the walking trips that I alluded to on the previous slide comes in. And I want to encourage us not to overinterpret the results that we present on walking trips. Because while for vehicle trips, there are numerous sort of outside data sources, external data sources that StreetLight can use to validate their creation of vehicle trips from those underlying LBS pings, vehicle counter data from automatic counters, from other sources, and there are a few bike counters as well, as we all know, throughout the region, in DC and Arlington in particular. There really aren't too many external data sources on the number of walking trips. And so it's much harder for them to validate their walking trip data against external sources, which is one reason why we caution not to overinterpret it. So for what region did we I should also note that when we talk about vehicle trips here, that's a shorthand way, but what we're really talking about is people in vehicles, right? So this is if there were 3 people sharing a vehicle, you would, and all 3 of those happen to be in the sample set of LBS data and therefore of trip records, they would be recognized each as a vehicle trip. That is not a huge source of concern, not least because many trips occur with one person in a vehicle, but also because here what we're really talking about is the impact of vehicles on roadways. So the study area that we looked at is DC and the 9 surrounding jurisdictions. We'll show a map in a moment, but that's important to note that it doesn't go out as far as some definitions of the region does. And to the time periods. So when we began this research in late summer of 2022, the most recent period for which the StreetLight trip records were available was March 2022. And so we didn't want to select March 2020 as the sort of pre-pandemic year because the pandemic was already blossoming. Those are attractive words for a terrible thing. The pandemic was already on us in March 2020. So we went back to March 2019 as the corresponding time in the year pre-pandemic. And for some analysis, we used Wednesdays as a potential midweek peak. And for other analyses, we used average trip volumes across all days of the week. And we'll get into some of that when Emily presents results. So I described a couple of the data limitations down there at the bottom already. So I think you've heard enough, and we may have questions on that. And we're happy to engage. On the other side, to the right of the screen, we used WMATA ridership data. Essentially trip ins, boardings, alightings, if it's a bus, enters and exits, if it's a rail station, to get an assessment of transit ridership in the same period, March 2022 and March 2019. Because this was a DC focused study, excuse me, just like for vehicles, we just looked at trips that touch DC. Here, we're just looking at metro rail stations and metro bus stops within DC. Same time period, March 2019 and March 2022, we did look at weekend data, and I should have noted that we looked at weekend data for vehicles as well. There's some limitations to this since this really is trip end data. It can't be directly compared to origin destination trips, et cetera, but we're looking at differences between 2019 and 2022, not absolute numbers. Excuse me, just a sec. Fighting off a cold, so thanks for indulging me. The other thing I want to note about transit data is it's just WMATA data. We did not include circulator data or VRE or MARC or Amtrak or any other commuter bus or any of those data sources. Next slide, please. So if you haven't had a chance to work with StreetLight AI data, it's a really, I've described it in some detail. It's a really interesting data source. They have a strong interface, which is what you're seeing here. But this is an example. This is an example of what working directly with the StreetLight data. Excuse me, I'm going to try not to cough in your ear. This is an example of what working with the StreetLight data directly looks like. This is their StreetLight Insight dashboard. So you can get results directly from it at a zone level, which is primarily how we were working here. And that's done on an annual license basis. And so Greater Washington retains access to that data. So what defined our study area? I mentioned it a couple of slides ago, but in graphic form, this is what we're looking at. So the region on the right, with some aggregation of the smaller jurisdictions in Virginia into larger ones. So you have the inner Virginia suburbs, the middle Virginia suburbs, Fairfax County and City. Excuse me. And the outer Virginia suburbs, and then each county in Maryland. Down towards the bottom, you see the wards defined. We did use 2022 wards. And then last, we used the definition of downtown DC that was first put forth in Move DC in 2014 as a proposed congestion pricing zone. I think Alex mentioned in her introduction that we led the work for DCST, DC Sustainable Transportation, to do a study of congestion pricing in DC a couple of years ago now, work that has not yet been released, but that's a definition of downtown that we used in that work as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I get to hand it over to Emily and stop coughing in your ear, and I'll be back in a little while. Emily?
Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. So Chris kind of provided the brief overview, gave you some teasers of kind of what we found, but now we're going to get to the kind of the nitty gritty, and I'll walk you through some of the findings of our study kind of by geography. So we'll start with downtown, but then we'll move to ward level changes and then back out to the kind of the larger study area and those jurisdictions and regions. So first, want to highlight some of the way that downtown DC travel changed between 2019 and 2022. What we found was that vehicle trips in downtown declined by 49%. And when we talk about trips downtown, we mean trips kind of that start or end in downtown or occur within downtown. And so 49% definitely more than the overall decline of 37% in the study area. But what we found was that the steepest decline was trips that just remained downtown, that started and ended in that general kind of downtown area that, as Chris said, was defined by the Move DC plan. Just a little insight before we kind of dive more into some of the facts. The downtown DC, it might be hard to tell from the thumbnail photo. It's a zone. It includes the CBD. It includes Capitol Hill area, Union Station, as well as Navy Yard. So when you think about the boundaries, they're roughly, Potomac and Anacostia Rivers, Rock Creek Park, and then it's bounded on the north by Mass Ave, M Street, and then on the east by 3rd Street Northeast. Moving back to the travel changes that we found for transit ridership from that WMATA data, we looked at all Metrorail stations and all Metrobus stops that were located in that downtown boundary. So Metrorail entrances and exits decreased by 72% downtown, and that's compared to 60% of a ridership decrease in stations in other parts of DC. Metrobus ridership decreased by only 52% in that downtown zone. And then just as a comparison, the decrease in other parts of DC was just 42%. Walking trips, StreetLight data found that there were decreases of about 51% of walking trips that started, ended, or occurred only within downtown. Just a disclaimer there, because as Chris noted, it's a smaller sample size, and we have and StreetLight has less ways to kind of calibrate and double check that info with actual kind of like walking counters like they do with the vehicle data where there's vehicle counters. Bike trips, as Chris noted, there were some increases. What we found as it relates to downtown DC, we saw that there were more short trips, but fewer long trips. So what that means really is that bike trips that happen between downtown and other parts of and outside of DC, that decreased, right? You think people that might be commuting for work, that decreased. And those are longer trips. Trips between downtown and other parts of DC, those trips also decreased by about 38%. What we did find decrease was trips that started and ended in downtown DC, and that was about a 3% increase. So moving on to some ward level impacts, got a quick summary here, and then we'll kind of dive in and focus on vehicle, bike, and transit separately. So just as an overview, what we found was that wards 2, 6, and 8, they had the largest decreases in vehicle trips and metro riderships. Those are also the wards that do contain do share zones with that downtown core. So when you think about what happened with where work and jobs are, it's kind of logical that would be where some of the decreases in travel was happening. Interesting finding here for Ward 1, which is the smallest geographical ward, but also the densest ward. It had less significant declines in vehicle trips and transit ridership, and then actually showed increases in bike trips. We also saw that we looked at the opposite, the wards that have the least residential density, wards 3 and 5, and found that they had kind of different travel trends. And wanted to share that kind of and highlight that here, where Ward 5, we saw increases in bike trips and less severe decreases in bus and rail ridership. Ward 3, on the other hand, had decreases in bike trips and then also more severe decreases in Metrorail and Metrobus ridership. Going into just kind of talk about what happened with respect to vehicle trips across the wards, we've got a table here on the left. The numbers on the far left column list the 8 wards. And then the second column is travel change of vehicle trips that start and end in the same ward. And then the far right column is travel change for vehicle trips that start in that ward but go to another part of DC. So what we see here, Ward 6 had the largest decrease in vehicle trips, for both types of those trips. And then wards 1 and 4 had the least significant changes in vehicle trips for trips that started and ended in the ward. So, you know, a negative of a 5% decrease. Ward 4 also had the lowest decrease in trips between that ward and other parts of DC. And that map just represents the data that you see in the far right column. So trips between that ward and other locations. Bicycle trips, those changes across ward, what we saw were most significant, again, kind of similar with downtown. Although there were, we saw the most an increase in short trips. So we wanted to highlight the data of bicycle trips that started and ended in the same ward. So what we see here is kind of really interesting display of variation of what was happening across DC. Wards 1, 4, and 5 had pretty substantial increases in bike trips, with Ward 1 having the highest at 53% increase. And then 2 wards, Ward 3 and Ward 8, had kind of larger decreases in bike trips at 11% and 28%. And then wards 2, 6, and 7 had kind of, you know, modest changes, either increases or decreases. Now on to Metro ridership across wards. So again, this table here on the right, the far left column is the list of wards, and then we've got Metrorail and Metrobus changes. So we're looking at metro stations and metro bus stops that are located in each ward and how ridership changes. So how ons and offs and enters and exits on those stations and buses changed. So as I mentioned before, wards 2, 6, and 8 saw pretty sharp decreases in transit. 7 also had a strong decrease. What's interesting about 7 is that although it had a pretty significant decrease in Metrorail ridership, it had the lowest decrease in Metrobus ridership. So that begins to make us it really highlights how people get around in different parts of DC and helps to explain kind of what are trips that people have to take and still are taking despite changes in, you know, work patterns and that sort of thing. So, you know, and we've said this before, across each ward, Metrobus has much less drastic declines than Metrorail. What's kind of an interesting thing we wanted to point out was that back in 2019, in March, the share of transit ridership on Metrobus, so the percent of WMATA customers per day, about 59% of WMATA's customers are bus riders over rail riders. And then that share of riders grew to 72% in 2022. So more people are on the bus than as compared to rail. And when you look, what's even more interesting is when you look at kind of the time of day, and we do have some charts and we'll get into that later. But throughout the course of the day, more of WMATA's customers are on the bus over rail. So by 7 p.m. In like average day of March 2022, 9 out of every 10 Metro riders in DC were on the bus. So last time we shared this data with a group with Greater Washington, and the smaller group, we had a lot of questions like, we know things have changed a lot since March 2022. We know it when we are on our bikes, in a car, or, you know, in the metro. And so we wanted to share with you guys some more recent data to be able to kind of show what's going on. Although StreetLight, they have an algorithm and it takes time for them to kind of curate and clean their data. We were able to look and use some of the resources that WMATA has in their ridership portal to be able to share kind of what we see now as trends that have happened since March 2022, just as a way that we can, like, you know, have a more robust conversation about this and talk, because things are still changing and did change between 2022 and December and now. So this is a slide from WMATA's ridership portal. They have PDFs that come out each month that have ridership snapshots. The most latest is from December 2022. And I just want to highlight here the March 2022 data, which I've kind of put maroon bars on both sides. This is the month that we're looking at, right? This is the month that we looked at for transit data, as well as the other modes for StreetLight, vehicle, bike, and walking. And, you know, March was a time of change, right? Where people were coming out of Omicron, different policies were going into effect at work maybe. And so we can tell that, you know, we took the average across this month, but as we look into the future, and if we continue studying the data, we'll see different types of decreases, hopefully more modest changes between 2019 and now. But, you know, we're still finding really fascinating trends and things to point out of what did change a lot and what didn't change as much in all of this data. Another slide I want to point out from this same document from WMATA is just kind of the chart here on the right, which shows, you know, weekday ridership decreasing, a decrease of 57%, and bus decreasing about 23%. And that's comparing December 2019 to December 2022. So those numbers do show more modest decreases in ridership compared to the numbers that we had for our DC specific, you know, March to March timeframe. So things are kind of like turning around, and ridership is still growing for this area. Another thing, just really want to quickly before I move on here, is that, you know, Sunday ridership is actually rebounding quicker than Saturday or weekday levels, and Saturday ridership is rebounding quicker than weekday levels. So as people begin to get out more and feel safe to do so, they're displaying that by getting out on the weekends, even if it's not as much on weekdays. Okay. Moving back in, shifting back to our study findings. We showed the downtown ward level data, and now we're moving to kind of more regional travel changes. So we looked at DC from a ward level, but overall want to spend some time talking about how that travel changed. So vehicle travel decreased by 35%. We know that within the study area, it was 37%, but for DC, it was just 35%. So a little more modest there. Metrorail ridership declined more than Metrobus, so 69% versus 44%. That's overall. So all of the stations and stops in DC. And then walking trips decreased by 41%, and biking trips increased by 4%, right? You know, there were very high increases in those really short trips, but there were still longer trips that were happening in DC in 2019 that maybe weren't happening later. So it kind of averaged out still to a positive number. Now regionally, we've got this map here on the right, and that's basically showing encompassing all of the study area that we looked at, counties that surround DC. And again, as a reminder, the travel that we studied here, this is for vehicle trips, for what the map data we're showing is trips that are happening between that jurisdiction and DC. So we're not really looking at, you know, data between Loudoun County and Prince William. We're looking at, you know, if someone started or stopped their trip in DC, then that's kind of the change that we're showing here. So a lot of variations here in what's happening with vehicle travel across the study area. You see Prince George's County, Fairfax County, and Prince William County having decreases around 35-36% in vehicle trips. And then Loudoun County and Montgomery County having larger decreases in vehicle trip volumes at 47 and 44% decrease. We combined the kind of the Northern Virginia area, as we call the inner Northern Virginia area of Arlington, Alexandria, Falls Church into one. And That area did also show higher decreases in vehicle trips between that area and DC at about 43%. And that could be something to do with the type of person that was going into DC and whether they might have opportunities to work from home more, and so are not making that trip anymore by vehicle. And then another thing I want to state here for the map is just that, we have the percent changes in bold. The number below is showing the magnitude, the actual decrease in trips, and not just the share. And so you can see here that, for instance, Prince George's County, between 2019 and 2022, a decrease in 150,000 vehicle trips per day. So that's a lot. The share of trips going into and out of DC between Prince George's County is still about the same between our area, but that's kind of that big chunk. Everything's kind of decreased. So although Loudoun County had a decrease of 47, that only accounts for about actually around 13,000 vehicle trips a day. And then just one more point is that the bike trips between DC and these other jurisdictions, that decreased by 63%. So again, that's a longer trip. Maybe those were commuting trips. So those decreased. Okay, I know people are writing comments in the chat and question and answer, and I'll get to that after if Chris can't already. And I'll get to that. We got 2 more slides, and we want to share kind of the travel change by time of day and travel change by day of the week too. So stay with me. So what you're seeing here in these graphs are first vehicle trips and then transit ridership changes by the time of the day. And the key point to remember in kind of reading the charts is that the dashed line is 2022 data, and the solid lines are 2019. So first, just want to look at, the vehicle trips. The solid red line is representing 2019 vehicle trips between DC and other jurisdictions, that we saw in that map in the previous slide. So what we see here is, that really strong AM peak, a dip in travel volumes in midday, and then a really high PM peak, the highest volume of trips happening in the PM commute rush hour. And that's compared to when you look at the dashed red line, again, trips between DC and other jurisdictions, a little different, the pattern is here. So we see the increase in the AM for, people getting to work, but there's no drop anymore, just a steady increase into the PM peak time. And so that's significant for us to kind of start understanding how people have changed, how they're getting around. The blue lines, again, those are trips that are occurring within DC, so starting and ending in DC. They have similar shapes, they slowly increase throughout the day, peak at midday between 10 and 3, whether those are errands, lunch break trips, that sort of thing. That hasn't changed, but there are less of them. So moving to the right, the slide, the graph that we have here for transit ridership, x-axis is a little different. So AM peak is right at the left. And again, solid lines are 2019. So what we saw in 2019, the gold line is the bus and the blue line is rail. We see that strong peak in AM, a dip in ridership in the midday, and then a peak in the PM. The dash lines, looking at them below, ridership does not dip in the midday nearly as much or at all. It doesn't dip for bus ridership, and it does only barely for Metrorail ridership. Instead, it's just kind of increase in the morning and then steady increase till the PM peak, and then declining to the evening and late night. So basically, bus ridership fell the least midday and evening. So this slide, similar type of data, but instead now we're looking at the day of the week. So for vehicle trips on the left, we've got the The solid lines are 2019 data. The gold line is trips between DC and other parts of the study area. And then the blue line is trips within DC. So really similar patterns here. Really what's happening is not as many people are driving, running around on Monday. Then it slowly increased throughout the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then peaking on Friday. And then a decrease in vehicle trips Saturday and Sunday. What we see now in 2022 is that, not as many people are getting around any day. But people are making significant differences on Friday, right? There's a strong peak, and maybe those are errands, those are people getting out of town, and it's happening in both types of trips, those from larger study area and then also just within DC. Now transit ridership, day of the week, we received the data and it had weekday averages, so we could not look at the difference between Monday through Friday. But we did want to highlight some findings that we saw here. Basically, again, the solid lines are 2019. And so bus ridership is still higher than rail on the weekday. And rail ridership is a little higher higher on the weekends, sorry. But what's really fascinating here is with the data that we looked at from 2019 to 2022, ridership is almost level when you're comparing weekday to weekend. So, I think some of this data might help influence both the day of the week and then also the time of day, influence WMATA and how they, help do schedule out, some of their frequency and what's important to riders moving forward in order to have reliable service. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chris to do the wrap up. You're muted.
I think I'm unmuted now. Yep. First of all, I want to thank Emily. That was a lot of material in those last maybe dozen slides, and I'm sure you all recognize that because in addition to the many questions we've seen come through the chat, I'm guessing you're all trying to think through what the implications of those results are, thinking about how robust are they, thinking about the fact that these are results from March of 2022, right? That's, as we described, StreetLight constructs the travel data from location-based cell phone pings, and that takes time, right? They're just getting to the point of releasing data for fall of 2022 now or soon. This is not uncommon in transportation, right? The GOG did a household travel survey 2017, 2018, I think, and just released the data last year. So it's just not uncommon to have to do that level of scrubbing, of analysis, of algorithmic work, however you want to describe it, before results are available. So thank you, Emily, for also describing how WMATA ridership has changed in the period since March, which our data is based on. So now, as Emily previewed, switching over into the mode of thinking about, okay, what does it mean? What are the implications for us? Now, I want to state up front that the focus of this study wasn't to develop policy recommendations. The focus really was to dive into the data, understand what it could tell us, what it couldn't, and begin to provide the results that we've described here. But there are a few implications that maybe can help us kick off a discussion here. Although, of course, we're happy to talk about the specifics of the data and the analysis more as well. So first, looking at the transit ridership data, people rely on the bus, right? We know this in DC. We know that reliable bus service is crucial, not just for essential workers to get to work, but for many people to live their daily lives. And whether that's by choice, by necessity, is much less important than understanding that bus is a service that spread out across, if it can provide quality service across the day and across the city, and ideally across the region, people can begin to organize their lives around, which can help us meet numerous goals. Priority bus lanes being one way that DC continues to try to support improving bus performance. WMATA's Better Bus Study is ongoing and should have results sometime later this year, I think. I'll note I live 2 blocks from Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast, and they're out building the bike lanes and the bus lanes even today, so improvements keep coming. Another implication that ties to that is that ridership is less focused on the peak, right? It's if we're arguing the bus service over better, higher quality bus service over the course of the day and the evening and the weekend is a priority. This really supports that, as well as for rail, but most predominantly for bus. Keep the frequency of service high midday and on the weekends, as I was describing. And then that evening finding, I won't say it surprised us, but it was strong enough that we wanted to highlight it, right? That people's evening travel around DC disproportionately is on the bus compared to rail. And that's an important, has implications for policy as well. Moving on to biking. Unlike every other mode we've talked about here, including walking, the number of bike trips that StreetLight was able to measure increased over the course of 2019 to 2022, right? And we know that up to 2019, bike ridership, bike usage had been growing in the district in particular, in the region more broadly, up till 2019 as well. So to the point now, StreetLight cautions very strongly against trying to knit together their data and construct mode share estimates, but important to note that 22% of bikes, or excuse me, 22% of streets, oh my gosh, 22% of trips on the street, so vehicles plus bikes, are on bikes in DC now. That's up from, and that's in 2022, up 7 percentage points, up 50% in terms of share from 2019. That is a huge result, and one that again points to investments DC has made, points to effects of pandemic and people maybe seeing their neighborhoods differently and beginning to try out other ways of getting around, especially for those short to medium trips. That supports the case for continuing reallocation of road space, as I just described on Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast. And I see somebody in a couple of notes in the chat about where some important links that maybe need to be strengthened, including across the park, could support even more bike ridership, which meets DC's goals. And then the last slide about vehicles, with the sort of cautionary notes from the beginning about the vehicle data we were looking at was for trips within the region that went to or from DC or within DC. But within that context, daily travel patterns clearly have changed, across days of the week, across times of day. We know that continues to change. We've heard the anecdotes about traffic in the suburbs is worse than it was pre-pandemic. These results do not speak to that, although certainly with StreetLight data, one could analyze that. But travel patterns for people traveling in vehicles to, from, and within DC certainly have changed across multiple dimensions. That argues that any approach to congestion pricing should recognize that. Like any approach to congestion pricing that relied on peak period or peak hour charging is going to be less effective if trips are more distributed across the day. But the roadway reallocation offers, continued interim step to addressing the need for some essentially metering or more equitable treatment of roadway capacity. It does feel important, and I don't want this to come off as self-serving because we did the congestion pricing study that hasn't yet been released, but it does point to things we know. Travel patterns are going to continue to change from here. It feels like they will continue to de-emphasize the peak of the peak, which has been, essentially the organizing principle behind transportation planning in the country for 50 years is make the peak of the peak a little bit less bad, right? That continuing to study how travel patterns are evolving and coupling that with how do we efficiently use our road space feels important, and these results inform that. Also, just want to note, something that came through in the congestion pricing study work as well is, some markets, some geographic markets, and here I'm thinking specifically of DC and Prince George's County. A lot of vehicle trips, a disproportionate number of vehicle trips in those markets, and that could point to a specific focus on better transit access and specifically bus access and maybe street space reallocation in the corridors that are important to that travel market. And I think that brings us to the end of our takeaways. And just want to say thank you on behalf of Emily and myself for listening to us, and hand it back to Alex to walk us through any questions or discussion.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Emily. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. The chat's been pretty busy, so I'm going to talk through some of it just for the record, while hopefully some of you place some more questions in there. Thank you, Emily and Chris, for responding sort of as we went. So I managed this project for Greater Washington. I had a really good time doing it. It was a one-off. We had funding one time to support the purchase of access to StreetLight and to support Nelson Nygaard's time in analyzing this data. I would love to do more of this. It's something that I hope we can pursue as an organization. We will need the funding to do it. So it's something that we're exploring, and such as working for a nonprofit. So if you wonder where your money goes, is to support this kind of stuff so we can find larger grants from funders to enable this kind of research and share it with you. We focused on the district in part because of this road pricing study that we keep talking about that is not available. And that makes some of this somewhat complicated. I wish I could refer you to the study. It's quite good. But again, the executive has not released that. And as far as I know, doesn't have any plans to. There was a question about the definition of downtown. And I do want to address that because I myself have spent like hours trying to define downtown. As a general rule, DC does not have any legal neighborhood boundaries. There's no legal boundaries for any neighborhood in the district, including downtown. The central employment area, which is used for like federal grant making purposes, is actually different from the central business district, which the district sometimes refers to as. There are two bids that serve what is considered downtown, the Golden Triangle bid and the downtown bid. There are a variety of neighborhoods that we refer to in the vernacular, such as Foggy Bottom, such as Penn Quarter, such as Logan Circle even sometimes. Everyone sort of has a personal, your mileage may vary definition of downtown. If you look at the mayor's comeback plan that she released in January, there is a sketch of downtown that doesn't really exactly look like anything that I've seen before. So I want to be clear that there's not a definition that we can go to and say, like, we're going to look at exactly this. There's a whole bunch of stuff that constitutes downtown. And that does make talking about downtown recovery, which is very much on, I think, most decision makers' minds right now, quite challenging. Again, to keep the projects that we've worked on consistent, and GGWash's involvement with the road pricing report was through a coalition that we manage, called the DC Sustainable Transportation Coalition. Because that coalition and Nelson Nygaard worked on the road pricing report, we wanted to keep that definition consistent across our work, knowing that no consistent definition really exists out in the world. So again, this would be made much easier if we had the road pricing study out, but it does, this definition reflects what is included in the 2014 Move DC plan. So I want to be clear about that just because like it does cause problems, right? Like this is not the first or only time that there is consternation over the definition of downtown. And believe me, like I've spent a lot of time trying to define it, not just for the purposes of this, but in general. And that's something that, barring any like legal definition, we're just going to have to work with it. So as you may have sensed, you know, a lot of this was influenced by our experience with working on the road pricing report, which was funded by the district, again, not released. But the sort of point of this was to provide a little bit more of a backstop to a lot of the anecdotes around recovery and transportation patterns. If you have sort of been reading the news and paying attention, you know, it's not just downtown, but the sort of general sense of what is the future of the district's economy. And there were a lot of anecdotes, certainly about where people were going, how they were moving around, were they coming back to work, when were they traveling, but we didn't really have any data. And the district didn't really have any data either. So we sort of undertook this to provide a little bit more clarity. You know, that said, and there are a lot of technical questions in the chat that I'm really glad to see, you know, it's not perfect. What it is what we have available, and we did our best with what we got. So again, like this was a one-off. I would love to do more of this. StreetLight has many limitations, but that's like, it's what we've got. And I think what is most compelling to me and sort of what I want to talk a little bit about is, you know, even more the implications of shifting away from a peak. You know, Chris and Emily, you sort of addressed that in your takeaways, but beyond just some of those high level things you shared, you know, what does that mean? Since both of you have worked in transit for so long and there has been such a reliance on the peak as like what we plan around, like, can we just have a little bit more of a free flowing discussion about that, which I think links into like planning bike lanes, planning bus lanes, and sort of how that might look going forward.
Yeah, I know, I think Chris summarized captured kind of the takeaways about what we're seeing for vehicle changes, that, you know, it might mean that looking, you know, if we were to look again at like congestion pricing, it wouldn't necessarily be charging at AM and PM peak for vehicles. I also saw a really thoughtful comment in the chat about, you know, that bus lanes may need to be 24/7, since, you know, there isn't as clear a AM PM peak, like what, you know, can the bus lane serve us better in an all-day fashion, given the way people's both transit and vehicle travel has changed.
I think, you know, seeing the sort of change in metro rail trips was an additional sort of like cause for stress and concern. And, you know, we knew the rise in bus trips before we took a look at the StreetLight stuff. WMATA had reported that, but that to me, I think does reflect the Better Bus Initiative has a little bit of a different mandate than what it was when WMATA initially like was talking about that. I think that has shifted a little bit. So I want to elevate Steve's point about bike use in Ward 3 and Ward 8 and how those both declined pretty precipitously. One thing I'm not sure we talked about is that this was more reflective in outer, like non-DC jurisdictions, the jurisdictions outside of DC, but that the drop in bike trips sort of like we could kind of assume that corresponded with like longer commuters using bike trails, and like that it may also be true, I think, for, you know, Ward 8's bike infrastructure is a little bit more trail based, and that may have had similar effects on that. So we saw big drops in these bike trips into DC from like outer jurisdictions where people might have been bike commuting along trails on fairly longer trips, and I suspect some of that may still, like that may have been reflected in Ward 8. I do think that there is a very salient point there, and that people will ride if there's infrastructure, which is certainly something that we will continue to support. I'm gonna, Paul, thank you for your comment. Do these data sets speak to the effects of changes in levels of service? For instance, Metrorail delay resulting in depressed ridership for a given market or trips displaced onto other modes?
Yeah, I could try to jump in on that one if helpful, Alex.
Yes, please.
They really don't. I mean, we tried to control for that to the extent we could by picking comparable time periods, so March to March, weekday to weekday, weekend to weekend, etc. But what we and one of the reasons we picked March is because it felt relatively stable. But what it can account for, what we have not accounted for, is a drop in ridership due to some sort of systemic change that is outside of WMATA service levels, or is the drop in ridership associated with changes in WMATA service levels? So that's, I think, a roundabout way of saying no. The data sets, the data that we analyzed and the analysis we did do not speak directly to changes in level of service. Now, intuitively, we can expect that yeah, some of the change in ridership is due to reduction in service. Emily, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, just adding, I mean, we picked March because it was the most available data set at the time when we first started study. And, you know, we wanted to get the most, you know, the most likely to have like rebounded type of data of like 2022, you know, we didn't want to capture like what happened in, you know, in April 2020, right? We wanted to be able to capture some time period where people had already made changes that were going, you know, back to their new normal and maybe speaking to that. And we used averages across the whole month. So it's not just, you know, WMATA ridership that might have changed because of some service or disruption. I mean, it's also vehicle trips that or bike trips to weather. And that's why we averaged out the whole month, you know, and use the same month for each year that we studied. But in the future, we do know that, you know, specifically for transit, when we do our transit studies, we really do like to request October data. Sometimes we look at spring data like April or May as some of the higher ridership time periods. And so when we look to like, you know, potentially analyze new data sets down the road that will, you know, show more trends and how things have changed even since, we'll kind of be keyed into more of those months, given that they might be more some stabilization, so we can pick and choose more.
And we've got Chris Z affirming Chris F's point, which again sort of speaks to, we can't capture everything with StreetLight data, and not everything is a result of the pandemic, right? Like, you know, reduced service has been sort of challenging, right? Like prior to the pandemic, that isn't like there were changes to that, it was declining, and then like the pandemic happened. So, you know, I think in looking at this, of course, we can acknowledge that this is all super intersectional with other factors, right? Like that this isn't done in a vacuum. We are just looking at what we can look at. Kaylee, thank you for your question. Do you know if some of the trips that used to go into DC are still being taken, that are staying more locally in Maryland and Virginia jurisdictions? I've seen other research showing a donut effect where downtowns have fewer trips, but it's partly offset by trips slightly further from the core.
Yeah, I provided a short answer in the chat, but Kaylee, we just didn't look at that. That data is available from StreetLight, of course, but I would not be surprised if we saw some of that. And in some sense, that is longer trips being replaced with shorter trips, you know, or maybe not around the neighborhood, but closer by to do sort of service and errand and, you know, drop off kinds of functions rather than what formerly might have been longer commuting trips. But we did not analyze that as part of this study.
Is there, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to jump to Bill's question. Go ahead.
I was just going to follow up on that. You know, is there any, like, does the data, Chris, this is a question for you, from me. So what we looked at the ward level in DC sort of imply any more movement around wards? Like, could we infer perhaps that some of the movement around wards, like that are not Ward 6, Ward 2, like the downtown wards, representative of these like trips more locally? Like, would that be it's not a perfect proxy, but
yeah, I think we can infer that. Yeah, that some trips that might have previously come downtown. And I'm not here thinking about mode specifically. Well, I guess I am mostly thinking about vehicle trips, but trips that might have previously been from Ward 5 to downtown, for example, are now, or Ward 4 to downtown, which is where we saw the least significant drop in vehicle trips, Ward 4. Some of those trips might have stayed within the ward that previously would have gone elsewhere.
I mean, and just to add, I mean, yeah, there's one standpoint where you could look at DC as the entire donut hole, or you could look at downtown as the donut hole and the rest of DC. And that's why we looked at the ward level changes. And, you know, there was a decrease for vehicle trips across all wards, even though there were wards that had less significant changes. So especially when you think about people that do trip pairing, you know, they're already in their car going somewhere, they've gone to work and now they're picking up something. And that kind of trip also would have happened less maybe. And that could help explain why there continue to be decreases even in the kind of undonut hole part of downtown.
Yeah, I think there's going to be, maybe not specific to this kind of work, but like going forward, I would hope to see sort of conversations around like the district's economy and trips and how they relate to economic activity, which of course, like we will do our best to influence. Talk about like what's going on in other places besides downtown and how that is reflective in like what the district's budget looks like, right? I don't have any massive conclusions to that, but I do think that what happens, you know, in neighborhoods that are not downtown versus downtown is an important piece of this, and we just don't know all of that yet. But that is certainly a framework or the direction in which like we're like at GGWash, the way that we're thinking about this. Bill's question, was change in walk trips same on weekdays and weekends, decline in office workers versus other factors like more online purchases versus in stores? Any other factors to discuss on the walk data?
Yeah, that's another one I threw an answer into the chat. We didn't do much with the walk data, Bill, because frankly, I don't quite believe it. Right now, we did talk to StreetLight extensively about this because I'm concerned that they're basically imputing walk trips from vehicle trips. Like if vehicle trips are this big, then probably about this share of them are walk trips. And then when the vehicle trips went down precipitously, that might have led them to say, okay, walk trips probably went down roughly proportionally. To be clear, they didn't say that's how they create walk, or how they, create's the right word, how they create walk trips from the LBS data, but I have real concerns. I don't believe that region-wide walk trips went down 50% between 2019 and 2022. It just doesn't seem supportable by any of the anecdotal data. Your suggestion or your query about looking at some subdivisions of that data that might help to at least give some insight into the relative change in those, or I guess the relative difference in change between those between weekdays and weekends, etc. But we didn't do that as part of this study. I see a Mr. Zimmerman in the chat saying that in all likelihood walk trips went up. I agree with that on a regional basis, certainly within downtown, with many fewer people in downtown on a typical day, that you might expect that trips that would have been captured as walk trips to or from Metro, walk trips for errands or whatever during the day might have been lower in some specific geographic markets, but I also expected walk trips to probably go up in that period. StreetLight, by the way, said they see this across regions, not just in DC, that walk trips declined roughly 50% during the pandemic. And again, that doesn't reassure me. That actually just makes me wonder a little bit more about their algorithms.
I just saw Gabe's question about, do you have any theories about the trip purposes of midday travel? Given that we're showing the new kind of slow increase from AM to PM without a dip. We did not look at trip purposes. There are some facets of StreetLight that we can do that with the additional time to look at the data. But I have thought about theories when you have two really high peaks, like in 2019, pre-pandemic. There's a lot of like other trips that are being kind of not being seen or respected as well, or clear. And so now with the decline of AM and PM peaks, I think what we're seeing now is that there was always that mid-range, right? That those trips didn't decline. So that I think that it's more, there's trips that are still happening, like errands, people who don't have traditional 9-to-5 jobs that are still trying to get to work or to home at those time periods, and that's more like the noise of the AM PM has been like scraped away a little bit, and now we're kind of just seeing the other part of the mountain.
Yeah, I think with certainly like remote work, like we had obviously like lockdown period, no one was going anywhere, right? Because legally you kind of couldn't. As we emerged from that, and that's 2020, March 2022 was kind of a weird time. It's like what's open, what's not open. It's moving towards that. We think we're getting there. But at least, and this is like based on Alex's personal anecdote of like what I did during the pandemic, but just because trips to work aren't happening doesn't mean that trips aren't happening, right? So people still are going to the grocery store. They may be taking their kids to childcare, they may be seeing family, they may be going to church, they may be going to the doctor. Like work trips are not the only trips that people take. And sometimes that's hard, right? Because a lot of times for planning, we use American Community Survey data, ACS data, like asks people the majority of time that they get to work. And this kind of StreetLight sort of like throws all of these trips because it's tracking like pings from your cell phone in your pocket. So that's a very different, you have to shift your brain a little bit. So I think that like, just because people weren't going into an office didn't mean that they weren't going anywhere, period. And that you see reflected in this like non-peakiness of like, people still have stuff to do during the day. And for those who had shifted from an office to working from home, they may take advantage of being at home and being able to run errands in their neighborhood. They may be trip chaining in a different way at a different time of day than we used to see. I personally, just as a like preference, like I think that sort of like steady activity and behavior throughout the course of the day like has a lot of potential benefits in the future, rather than just being these two peaks in the morning and in the evening and focusing all of our service on peaks. I think this is a good way to get out of that sort of like being so beholden to that peakiness, which like just can be stressful in some ways, but also like is maybe not necessarily reflective of how people are living their lives now. So that is my spiel on people moving around outside of peaks and work trips. Thank you, Haroon, for walk trips. Did you all try to differentiate between walk access to transit trips and all walk between origins and destinations?
I did see Haroon's message and tried to answer it in the chat. That's that I'm not sure that the StreetLight data would provide that kind of purpose information about a trip, but looking at the geography of a trip, it should be able to, well, could you actually isolate transit stop locations from all the other places people might be going? I'm thinking out loud here. I'm not positive you could do that with StreetLight data. What I am positive about is that we didn't try to. As I mentioned, again, mostly due to my distrust of the walking data, we didn't really invest much in the, well, we didn't invest beyond looking at the large geography changes in walk trips. We didn't look at other segmentations. Since I'm already talking, I see Andrew's question about non-StreetLight data sources. There are a few other vendors out there. StreetLight's been at this for longer than not longer than Google, but Google is not providing a commercial sort of travel focused data set from their work. My understanding is whatever data they accumulate on you, they keep fairly proprietary. I think most of the LBS data that StreetLight and other companies can access comes from app developers or app providers themselves who do cell phone pings. So, and Google, I don't believe, is one of them. Could be wrong about that. There's a lot about this frontier that I don't fully understand. I do believe if Kaylee's on and could jump into the chat, I believe that the LBS data that WMATA is using is from a private firm, not a totally commercially available source, but also a probably very useful source. So there are multiple sources out there for this kind of work. And Gabe, since I'm still talking, did you compare StreetLight's transit data to the WMATA trips? Oh, Gabe, thank you for answering that question that I should have directed at you. Cambridge Systematics Locus is their effort, and they're a transportation planning firm. So if anybody, StreetLight is very focused on this market as well, but companies like that are more likely to be able to give us the kind of insight we need compared to, say, a Google. Did we compare StreetLight's transit trips to WMATA trips? I think we did not look at StreetLight's transit trips. Correct, Emily?
Yeah, we didn't purchase that as the package. It was fairly, it might not have even been an option when we started the subscription. And so we went, we went straight to WMATA for that data.
Yep.
This is a feature of the budget, is that we figured we could get the transit trip data from WMATA, so that we spent a little bit more on the StreetLight side on driving trips, vehicle trips, and bike trips. So again, not perfect, many other options. This works the best for us. I appreciated the question a little bit up thread about funding. Like I said, we had a grant for this. I think, to be honest about it, it was about $50K, which like enabled the purchase of the data and consulting time, and as well as GGWash staff time. To support more work like this, the best thing you can do is support us. We definitely don't expect our individual donors to fund research like that. But we always appreciate our monthly recurring donors who are just super stable presences, and anything that you want to send in our direction enables our staff, including me, to be present on this stuff, write grants, apply for grants, and sort of put together like this kind of programming. So that's just the general fundraising spiel, and that way you don't have to hear it at the end of this. That's kind of where this came from. But this has been really, just from a like programming perspective for how I kind of use this stuff in my work. Right now, the council, DC Council, is in the middle of procurement budget and oversight. So this has been really helpful for my work. The DDOT hearing, the DDOT oversight hearing is coming up on Monday, February 27th. If anyone's tuning into that, or likes to look at testimony from that, you'll definitely hear and see some information from this project in my testimony to talk about what we think the district government should do going forward. So it's been really nice to have some stuff to lean on and be able to talk about, and that's just kind of how like we're looking at research and sort of moving that into like the things that we actually do on a day-to-day basis as an advocacy organization. But yeah, that's my spiel. I want to pull up just some of the other questions in the chat so that they don't get totally lost for those who are going to watch this on the replay. This study did not involve any disaggregation of data by demographic group. I would love to know that, right? Like that would be super fascinating. I would love to know that. It was not within the scope of this project. It's something that I hope we can build out in the future. But we were looking pretty specifically at just trips. Anything to add on that, Chris and Emily? I think that's fairly straightforward.
No, and I appreciate you elevating some of the questions from the chat. I think we tried to address them all, although I noticed, I can't believe Zoom hasn't fixed their chat in the 3 years we've all been relying on it. I noticed some people addressed comments to hosts and panelists and some to everyone. I might have answered some to everyone that were only posted to hosts and panelists. So if there's anything in there that confused you because you saw an answer to and not a question, maybe shout out in the chat and Alex can, or I can articulate those better.
Another note with WMATA buses becoming free for trips beginning in the District of Columbia, are there alternative data measures for determining ridership than fare transactions?
Ooh, this is where maybe Gabe or Kaylee or people from WMATA might be able to chime
If
in.
WMATA friends want to provide details, by all means, please do so. See what else have we got in here. I
mean, I do just want to add that. I mean, if buses become free, the demand will increase. Like from all we know from, transit and modeling and ridership, that, there will likely be more trips happening if there's free fare.
But if the question was about how does WMATA's data, there you go. Gabe says they use APC data from buses, which is this is where my knowledge breaks down quickly. I think does not rely on a fare tap. It's just someone coming onto the bus. It's a light beam or some other sort of measurement. There you go, Ian. Thank you. Sensors at the doors. I think as deep as I dove into this, was trying to figure out how you were constructing your estimates for during the pandemic when people were boarding at rear doors, and it was a very different environment, of course. So thank you, Gabe and Ian, for helping to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you to our bus planner friends. We're glad you're here. In terms of distinguishing single occupancy vehicle trips from other sort of vehicle trips, no, because again, StreetLight is tracking phone pings from your phone on you, and sort of crushing that through a big algorithm that I am not fully equipped to explain on this call, nor would anybody want me to do that. That like, this is both, I've been thinking about this a lot recently because typically we want disaggregated data, we want detail, we want to know stuff. I think what is compelling for me about looking at this at like all vehicle trips is just understanding in parts of my brain, like this is how people are moving by what we can assume is a vehicle. This is how we can assume people are moving by maybe a bike or scooter, right? Like since that's at a slower speed, this is how we can assume people are walking. So chunking that out has been really helpful. I've learned more recently about some of our air quality data during the pandemic. And one thing that, I think is super valuable to take note of is the difference between like light and heavy duty freight and that implications for air quality. It's my understanding that light duty, including single occupancy vehicle trips, dropped during the pandemic, but heavy duty freight stayed about the same. That didn't come from this research. That's just some stuff that seems to be out in the world. But that I think, with our experience with the StreetLight data, it's actually helpful to consider this as like all vehicle trips. If you, like us as an organization, share the goal of reducing vehicle trips, because I think that provides the argument for especially some of the environmental impacts of reducing trips overall, regardless of the type of vehicle that they're being made in, if it is gas powered. So that I think like it's been more helpful than I expected in that regard, to not have those trips distinguished. And that's not a way that I typically would have thought about this. So it would be great to know more, of course, but I think that has had its advantages. Let's see, I think we had a question about induced demand. Are we seeing any induced demand in this? And like, typically we talk about induced demand with highways and highway expansions. But like, how would you apply that concept to what we've got here?
Although we just talked about with buses becoming fare free for trips in the District of Columbia, you will see demand induced by improved quality of service. It's not, the question is, how is it showing up in this data set? Again, measuring induced demand would rely on understanding the service side as well as the sort of response side, in this case, the trips that respond to whatever the service level is. So we did not look at it in this. One thing we've talked about with Alex is because StreetLight, this is very fine-grained data, right? It's representing individual trips. So could you, for example, look at before and after a major new bike facility was introduced, and what was the resulting change in travel patterns, like the bike lanes across 15th Street, excuse me, on 15th Street across the National Mall that Emily mentioned we were very happy to be a part of designing a couple of years ago. Yeah, the StreetLight data does offer the promise to be able to look at data at that, or look at results at that kind of granularity. So you could see the induced demand in bike trips from people, from the opening of that new facility. What it couldn't do, of course, is separate out what are the other things that led to that change in demand.
Let's see. This has been good. I think we're sort of in the wind down of this. So if anybody has any additional questions, feel free to get them in the chat and the Q&A. But I think this has been like already helpful in some ways, in just being able to provide information about the change in trips, right? There are always going to be caveats to this data, but I do find the upward direction of bike trips certainly pretty striking and very validating for me, a person who's worked in this for a while. But one of the big takeaways from me, or for me, for this is that trips can change and they will change. When we presented this data before, what I've said is that we don't want a pandemic to be the inciting event, right? People lost their lives. It was a public health crisis. So that's not, like, no one is saying like, let's have another pandemic so we can get bike trips to go back up. But we talk about sticks and carrots in transportation planning and advocacy. And I think this gives some weight to the fact that people will change their trips given some sort of exogenous shock or change or something, and that the potential for trips to shift is a really positive one to different modes, especially if the infrastructure is there. So, we've got over 100 people who I think elected to be on a GGWash webinar during lunch. So I think we are fairly unified on these beliefs, but, sharing this data with some people who are not as transit pilled as we are, I think can be a little bit alarming, and seeing that big of a drop in car trips. For this audience, we might all be like, that's nice, dropping car trips is good, right? That's what we talk about a lot. When I first saw this data, when Emily and Chris first shared it with us, the environmentalist part of my brain was like, dropping car trips, this is amazing. These are the kind of drops in car trips that we want to see. But because, trips by car are often considered economic activity, and there is enough research in the world to sort of demonstrate that link is not necessarily causal, even if it is very culturally correlated. That drop can be a real shock and sort of affirm some priors, I think, that especially decision makers may have about the future of especially downtown. But to me, that says that there's a lot of potential for the ability to shift trips and change the way that people are moving around. And that's what I'm excited about, since I think this gives us a good platform to have that conversation and move it forward. And I hope that we're able to have it in more forums and with more people. And I think if, that's it, we can all reclaim, Bill, okay, induced demand. StreetLight data report in December suggests at least induced cut-through vehicle traffic on some downtown DC office streets. It reported neighborhood travel data with vehicle traffic back to 95% pre-pandemic levels and several key downtown office heavy streets, even though area offices only at 50% occupancy, reflected in very low pedestrian levels.
No, we were not involved in that work. I actually don't know. StreetLight produces all sorts of analysis of their own data, and I actually don't know if they do that all in-house at StreetLight or if they work with outside support. But we were not involved in that.
And I'm not super surprised to see vehicle traffic back like that. It did become easier to drive during the pandemic because there were fewer people out in the world, right? I hate this, but congestion is often our best traffic calming measure. Like, I don't think that's the standard to which we should be holding ourselves. But, it is often true that like that happens. So I think when it became easier to drive during the pandemic, and many people were wary of transit, even though transit had pretty good air circulation, we learned a lot more in the course of 2 to 3 years and all became individual epidemiologists, right? So like that doesn't super surprise me, is that like driving became both easier and then preferable because in some ways it kept you away from other people. And we are in a different world now and we're gonna have to work with that. We are recording this, we will share it. If you register for the webinar, you will get this to your inbox along with these slides. The report, we're finishing it up. We'll share it with you when it's done. Yeah, feel free to revisit this. Send me any questions that you might have. My email is abaca@ggwash.org. I'll do my best to answer or get you the answer. Beyond that, thanks so much for being here. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Emily. Thank you everyone for your time, and hopefully we will see y'all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.